Live from the 8th Layer Media Studios in the back rooms of the deep web, this is the FAIK Files. My name is Mason Amadeus, and this week we are bringing you what might be my favorite episode of the show ever so far. I know I'm not supposed to pick favorites, but this interview is awesome. We got to sit down and chat with Dr. Ian Gold, who is a professor of philosophy and psychiatry at McGill University, author of the book Suspicious Minds, which is the basis for a new podcast called Suspicious Minds that is all about AI psychosis. But Ian goes into way more depth. He is unbelievably smart, and he sat down to talk with us about AI psychosis, but also psychosis and delusions in general, and what that means in a concrete, definitive way. And we went from there to go on to talk about things like the Truman Show Delusion, the things in your life that can raise your psychosis threshold, including a lot of environmental and social factors you might not be expecting. We also explore how culture and environment, including the virtual environment of the internet, act as risk factors for mental illness and psychosis. And we go on to talk about how AI is kind of a unique entity in this space in the way that it pushes and pulls on all of these different human impulses. It's a phenomenal interview. I really can't wait for you to hear it. So without further ado, I'm going to drop us right in there. We're going to sit down and chat with Ian. And then after that, I'll tell you all about the podcast and the book and where you can find more of him. But right now, just sit back, relax, and try not to let this raise your psychosis threshold. We'll open up the FAIK Files right after this.
All right. So, Ian, there is a phrase that's used in the 2014 book, Suspicious Minds, that I think is applicable for us to be talking about today. Now, it can sound a little bit harsh when we say it this way, specifically talking about like AI and where we are, but I think the broader statement is definitely something that we can wrestle with, which is that every generation or every age gets the psychopath that it deserves, or the psychosis that it deserves. Can you talk us through that and like where your minds were, where your hearts were as you were writing the book back in 2014? Then we can flash forward to where we are today.
The primary idea in the book is that what we say about other mental illnesses, namely that the world that the person lives in makes a difference, we don't say about psychosis. In other words, we have this idea that goes back a long way that says psychosis is a biological illness. It's a function of something wrong with your genes and then something wrong with your brain. It's, as sometimes is said, it's a broken brain. And in that sense, psychosis, even in psychiatry, is thought of as something completely different. And what we try to do in our book is to say, no, that's not the case. Psychosis is just the same as depression, anxiety, OCD, and so on, which is to say it is shaped by culture and may even be the result of cultural and psychological factors of all kinds. And so in that sense, the madness that we see now is a function of the culture that we have.
Yeah, so culture, society, these are shaping forces that are pushing in on the human condition, and out of that comes a response that is indicative of or shaped largely by that thing that's poking us, right?
Exactly. I mean, there are in fact two distinct things that I've run together. One is that when we express symptoms of madness, symptoms of psychosis, we express them using the terms that we draw on from our own experience, and that includes cultural experience. So, for example, if I have a paranoid delusion, I live in Canada, I might be focused, say, on the Canadian Secret Service, or maybe the American Secret Service. But if I'm having the same kind of delusion, say, in China, I'm not going to be focused on American institutions or Canadian institutions. I'm afraid of something which is in my environment. So in that minimal sense, the way in which psychosis is expressed is going to be a function of the culture that the person is living in. But then more radically, there is lots of evidence that the cultural world we live in also raises your risk of psychosis. And I can tell you lots more about that. But for example, being an immigrant actually raises the risk of developing psychosis. And so when we start to think about AI, as I guess we'll talk about shortly, the fact that our culture is changing is for us very significant with respect to psychosis.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think we jumped in on the deep end, so now we can move out to the shallow waters,
paddle back into the shallow waters. Yeah,
establish a little bit of a foundation for the listeners. But I think that was critical to hit on.
I do too. And I think just right from there, we should jump into the pool rules, I guess, and say, like, what is psychosis? What is delusion? Because we throw a lot of words around, casually that have very specific meanings. And so
absolutely,
I'd like to hear from you.
Absolutely. So psychosis is the psychiatric term for what used to be called roughly madness. I mean, madness didn't have a very, very specific meaning, but psychosis is the name not of a psychiatric disorder, but a family of disorders that includes most notably schizophrenia. But you can also have psychotic symptoms in bipolar disorder, in severe depression, and you also see psychotic symptoms in other disorders, including, interestingly and importantly, in dementia, which is something that doesn't get much discussed. So psychosis is the name for any of the illnesses that have certain symptoms. And the primary symptoms are delusions, which are beliefs, and hallucinations, which are perception-like experiences. In schizophrenia, there's a third type of symptom that's called thought disorder, which tends to be more associated with schizophrenia in particular. So what that means is that hearing voices, sometimes seeing things under certain conditions is a psychotic symptom, and especially having these very, very strange beliefs, delusional beliefs, that's a psychotic symptom. And if you have those symptoms, then you're in a psychotic state, and some of those states are characterized as illnesses.
Interesting. Does and this might be out of left field, but I was just thinking about OCD. Is OCD a disorder that would have crossover with that, or is that a different thing?
No, it's different. Though what's very interesting is that there are disorders in which you have states that are very similar to, say, having a delusion. So suppose you're someone who is very, very narcissistic, okay? And you believe that, you're the smartest guy in the class, and you're the best looking guy in the class, or, in the country, or whatever it might be. You have a belief that is not supported by the evidence, that's not consistent with what everyone else believes, and so on. And actually, that's pretty close to a characterization of a delusion. And yet, there are certain features of delusions in psychosis that seem to be a bit unique. So the delusions are often extremely bizarre. Mm-hmm. You might believe that people can read your mind, or that you can read other people's minds. You might believe that you're dead, and so on. So it's not just a belief that is very extreme, as one sees in other psychiatric disorders. In the case of OCD, it's another good example, right? You have this, not quite a belief, but this worry that maybe you've left the stove on, for example. That is a kind of a rumination. It's a thought that keeps recurring, and you know that it's not supported by the evidence. And so again, it's a little bit like a delusion. And it is sometimes hard to separate those, right? We don't have a good definition of delusion that will say, oh, the ones here are definitely delusions and the ones over there are definitely not. So you're quite right to point to this issue. The other place you see kind of overlaps is in conspiracy theories. If I believe, that the government is, tapping my phone, is out to damage my social group, or, do whatever it's going to do, when I have those beliefs that are unsupported by the evidence, they start to sound a little bit like delusions. Let's take an even more extreme case, right? My belief that Bill Gates is tracking me through a microchip that was in a COVID vaccine, right? That was a belief that was pretty common. What makes that different from a delusion? I have to tell you, psychiatry does not have an answer to that question. Now, in practice, psychiatrists, I think, I'm not a psychiatrist myself, I'm an academic, I think psychiatrists make those distinctions by noticing what else somebody believes, or what other emotional state they're in, okay? If you come into my office, suppose I'm a psychiatrist, and you say to me, Dr. Gold, I just took a COVID vaccine, and I woke up this morning and I realized suddenly that Bill Gates was tracking me because there must have been a microchip. All things equal, you're going to say, this sounds like a psychotic belief. This sounds like a delusion. If I come into your office and say, Dr. Gold, did you know that Americans all over the country are being tracked by microchips that Bill Gates had put in COVID vaccines? Psychiatrists are going to say, all things equal, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. And the big difference is conspiracy theories are not symptoms of illness, but delusions are. Okay.
So it drives the treatment choices that you would make then.
Oh, absolutely. You won't treat someone with a conspiracy theory. I mean, conspiracy theories are incredibly common now. 10,000 Canadians can't be wrong. 10,000 Americans can't be wrong. So it would be pretty shocking if somebody were to say, oh, no, it turns out conspiracy theories are symptoms of a psychiatric disorder. So a person with that belief doesn't get treated, isn't thought to have a problem. But someone with a belief that's almost identical will be thought to have a symptom that suggests they have a severe psychiatric disorder.
Yeah.
So you're pointing to a really important question to make this clear. We don't have a precise definition of what a delusion is, and we can't always distinguish it either from beliefs in other psychiatric disorders or so-called healthy beliefs that seem to many of us to be eccentric.
So with the conspiracy theory, and this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but so we don't need to stay on it too long. If somebody were to fall for the conspiracy theory because they went down a rabbit hole, that is one thing. But would you say that somebody that has a propensity to fall for several different conspiracy theories in more like a serial fashion, that would be more related to a psychosis, or is that still just an informational issue?
I think it's still informational. You may know that the best predictor of whether someone is going to develop a conspiracy theory is actually that they already have a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right that people who have a propensity for conspiracy beliefs tend to acquire more and more and more of them, often moving from one to the other. And in fact, interestingly, they can have beliefs that conspiracy theories that are incompatible with one another, right?
Yeah.
So there are lots of people who believe Princess Di, was murdered by, the British royal house, and they also believe that Princess Di is still alive.
Right.
That there's a conspiracy to hide her death. Those can't both be right. So there seems to be some psychological disposition to those kinds of beliefs, and there's no doubt that there is some overlap here. There's some psychological overlap. We saw this particularly in COVID. People who tend to have conspiracy theories will also have some sort of informal tendency. The data is not very good, but in general, these two phenomena seem to be quite distinct. So in other words, if you have a relative who has lots and lots of conspiracy beliefs, there's no reason to think they're ever going to develop a psychiatric disorder. And yet people who have one will sometimes answer questions that suggest maybe they're disposed to the other.
Interesting.
There's two questions that I want to get out real quick, and I think we can turn pretty hard into the AI stuff. So one is a stupid question, but I would love to get your thoughtful response on it. Is that since all of us see the world through the things that have shaped our lives, the culture, the experiences, the upbringing, the values that our parents had, and all that, are we all a little bit delusional since they affect our beliefs?
So I guess what I'd say is delusions, as I use it, refer to very, very narrowly to those clinical phenomena that psychiatrists identify. And I think it's important just to keep those terms clear. But if you're asking me about the beliefs that we have, so now speaking more, say, as a philosopher, right, you're absolutely right. Of course, the beliefs that we have are powerfully stimulated and shaped by the environment that we live in. And the extent to which that's true will vary from person to person. And I don't know that we've got a good way of quantifying it. But there's no doubt that our beliefs, whether true or false, are affected by environment. And of course, we're going to be disposed to believe things that that we're used to, that our environment suggests are true. And those may be quite far away from what is actually true.
So hinge question into the AI topics then. Outside of the psychological impact of AI, what are your thoughts on AI in general? I'm trying to, more than anything, get a baseline to see like where the bias for the conversation is going to go. And I'm using the word bias in a neutral way as much as possible.
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, there's lots to say about that because, so I'm old enough that the kinds of questions that I'm a philosopher by training and philosopher of mind by training. So when I was a grad student, we were thinking hard about AI. That was one of the central topics that philosophy students were interested in. In particular, we were thinking about the question of how we should define AI. Was something that could simulate what human beings did. Was that AI, or did it have to be like human beings in its capacities, right? Could it be unconscious? Could it be, right? Or did it have to be conscious? And so on. And I'm old enough to have seen advances in AI, say like IBM's Deep Blue, pretty impressive, beating the greatest chess player who ever lived. My views of AI have absolutely changed since the advent of large language models, like a lot of people. So I think we are, there's a reason why your podcast is happening now, and wouldn't have been interesting 20 years ago.
Right.
Is sort of the current iteration of large language models, and this is just a philosophy question.
Sure.
Is this current iteration of large language models the first real P-zombie we've ever seen, like in the world? Or have P-zombies existed outside of being a mental construct before now?
Well, it's a great question, and it's going to depend. You're thinking of Chalmers's zombies?
I believe so. I'm nowhere near as well versed as you.
Phenomenal zombie. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we should define that for viewers real quick too.
Yeah. So a zombie, as a philosophical zombie, is supposed to be an entity that's exactly like a human being, except that it's not conscious, right? And so, here I am talking to you, and you guys are clearly human, and so on and so forth, and you act like any human being I know, and I assume that you're just like me in various general respects. Suppose it turns out that, you're unconscious, that you have no experience. It's nothing like it, to be like you, then you're a zombie, right? So from the outside, you look the same as a human being, as a normal conscious human being. From the inside, you're not, right? The lights are out. There's no one home. Now, I certainly think there's no reason to think that anything that we've got now is conscious.
No.
The interesting question, I think, long before we get to consciousness, that would be, not that consciousness isn't interesting. That would be the most interesting question.
Yeah, that would be crazy, right?
Yeah, that would be one. So the intermediate questions, though, have to do with intelligence. And I think it's important to point out that, that we should distinguish intelligence from consciousness for a whole bunch of reasons, not least that a lot of our own intelligence is deployed unconsciously, right? So what's happening in your conscious mind is not everything that's happening to you, and it's not everything by any means that's involved in you doing intelligent things. So when we think, say, about ChatGPT, it's definitely not conscious, but is it intelligent in some way that seems to apply to us too? Yeah.
How is that as a philosopher to have gone from when it seemed like this sort of thing was probably not going to be like this to suddenly it's here? How is that just experientially before we dive into the AI psychosis bit?
It's absolutely wild. It's like one, because I remember where I was sitting. It's like one of those moments. Where were you when John Lennon died? I remember what I was doing when my nephew and my sister's oldest son showed me ChatGPT for the first time 2 years ago, whatever it was. It really blew my mind. When Deep Blue, I was a postdoc, and Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, and everyone was talking about this in philosophy departments. This was a big, at least in my department, it's a big topic of conversation. I was really unimpressed. It was a big deal. Not that it wasn't an accomplishment, but it didn't remotely make me think, my goodness, we're entering some new era of intelligent machines. It just didn't. It didn't have that effect on me. Whereas ChatGPT really did, and I think it's independently, an interesting set of questions. Why large language models make you have that feeling, right? And that may be part of the topic we want to think about, certainly for our culture. What is it now, not just to have these intelligent systems, but for those intelligent systems to affect us the way that they do? They need not, right? You could imagine deploying something like ChatGPT in a way that doesn't feel like an interlocutor. And anyways, that's an interesting and important question. But I absolutely, yes, you absolutely are right that for me, it really was one of those, oh my gosh, this is utterly new.
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience, right? Because I was around also when Deep Blue came out, and even with things like AlphaGo, and you look at that and you're like, yeah, that's really amazing math that was behind that,
Right?
And then suddenly you have like the Chat GPT moment, and it's like there's creativity in the generative part of generative AI,
Absolutely.
and that creativity is non-deterministic in nature, which feels a little bit more human. And it also gets to where you have those philosophical discussions, because some people say, well, it's fancy autocomplete. And it's, forward only next token generator. But at the same time, when I'm thinking about the way that I string thoughts and language together, it feels the same, right? I am, in a lot of ways, when I'm speaking out loud right now, I'm like seeking for that next token. And that feels like what a large language model might be doing. And it is all based in context and where the spotlight of attention is at any given time.
Absolutely. It's interesting you say that. I have a very brilliant student called Olivia Leone, and she's a machine learning person. And we were chatting about ChatGPT. She works on machine learning in psychiatry, machine learning models of psychiatric disorders. And I said something like, well, look, it's really cool and it's really amazing what it does. But after all, it's only doing, word prediction and so on, And she looked at me, she said, well, maybe that's all we're doing. And it really took me aback because, of course, we have no sense of what it is we're doing. And so merely pointing out that the system works according to some sort of principle that sounds simple says absolutely nothing of how good an approximation it is of us, at least until we know how we work. Not that you're suggesting or anyone is suggesting that these large language models are us. But what's of interest is, are these large language models doing things in ways that might actually suggest something about how we do things? That's important. Maybe in some very narrow domain, maybe some component of something we do. That, if that turned out to be true, that wouldn't particularly surprise me. And more interestingly, and maybe to come back to your question about how my thoughts about AI have shifted, one of the things, this is not unique to me by any means, of course, one of the things that's different now to when I was a grad student is that in the old days, when I was a grad student, people were interested in the question of, could you build artificial systems that were intelligent like people, as I said a minute ago, right? And now that question seems much less pressing. Who cares? I mean, and in one mode, I feel the same way. Who cares whether ChatGPT works like I do or not? It does a job. In fact, it does it better than I can do it, or certainly it does it faster than I can do it. And if we can build systems that do those things, that's really interesting and really important. And I couldn't care less whether I'm building something that's like me or not. I think the question of the relationship of what we can use about what we know about human beings to build systems, and what we can learn about human beings by looking at new systems, all that's really interesting. But there is now this new set of questions about artificial intelligence in whatever form it comes.
I think it's really tough to try and separate all of the things that are very interesting and fascinating about large language models from the societal context in which they exist now, which is that they're owned by companies hungry for your data, about to feed you advertising. And, we develop this essentially new computing technique. And the first thing we do is create a monthly service to robocall your mom. And so it's tough to be a person who is previously excited about technology and now entering this, trying to think, oh, this is really cool. But at the same time, it's causing all these societal ills, like the newly coined term AI psychosis. Although I kind of, it's not necessarily the same, but you're the person I saw on your website, or a website about you, that you coined the Truman Show Delusion as a term, right?
It was actually my brother's term. Many psychiatrists were seeing these patients, but he was the first person to write something about this, and he used the term Truman Show Delusion to capture it. Yeah,
because I feel like that is when you think of the prototypical person experiencing psychosis, is that I'm being recorded, I'm being surveilled by everything. But this AI psychosis seems to be a different sort of inward retracting thing, where people get sucked into these ideas that this machine that is validating everything they say, and telling you you're special and you're unlocking things. This feels kind of like an inversion of that in a way that I think is interesting, but I don't know if that's a valid observation or not.
No, it's a fascinating observation. And I guess the first thing to say about that is that we're still trying to figure out what this phenomenon is. I mean, there's clearly something going on here. It's been called AI psychosis. We don't yet have good data, right? We haven't done experiments. We haven't done lots of case studies. We haven't got people together and kind of systematically gone after an attempt to figure out what this phenomenon is. So there's something going on here. And it certainly looks like psychosis in the sense that the person engaging with large language models or whatever else they're doing have beliefs that clearly seem to be, in some informal sense, disconnected from reality in ways that look like psychosis. Now, the reason I'm being a little hesitant here is just because, as I said a few minutes ago, there are lots of beliefs that human beings have, even healthy human beings, that seem pretty out there. And I think we ought to be cautious about saying, oh, it's really weird, so it's psychosis. Not because I don't think we should stigmatize anybody, including people with psychosis, as a function of their beliefs, but just because we want to understand things better, and understanding things better means making distinctions and so on. Okay. Having said that, I also think that we have to take seriously the idea that this is some sort of psychiatric disorder or a state that's disordered in some way, because I'm a guy who believes that the environment has a big effect on the beliefs that you have, including the pathological beliefs. So, of course, if you think that psychosis is just a biological disorder, that the only way to get it is to have certain genes and to have certain kinds of problems with your brain and nothing else contributes, then, of course, it seems very implausible that talking to ChatGPT over a weekend is going to give you a psychotic experience. But I'm not that kind of person, right? I think that there's the psychological and the cultural and the personal history does make a difference. And so I have to be open, and I think psychiatry in general should be open to the idea that certain kinds of experience can actually induce psychotic states. Let me give you an example of the one that I think is closest to what we might be thinking about.
Sure.
It's a rare disorder. There's a couple of disorders like this that are sufficiently rare that our data is not great, but there's a sort of consensus that these things are real. The first one is called the Jerusalem syndrome. And this is a syndrome in which people turn up in Jerusalem and develop a psychotic disorder. And many people who are in that situation, I mean, it's obviously real. I've been to the hospital and talked to a psychiatrist who treated these patients. Some of these folks are people who were developing a psychotic disorder to begin with, and they develop religious ideas, which is a category of delusion, and they go to Jerusalem to pursue their ideas, as it were. Okay, so that's not particularly interesting. But there seems to be a category, at least there's good evidence for the idea that there is a category of person who turns up in Jerusalem with no history of mental illness, and because they have the appropriate religious beliefs, and it need not be Jewish, it can be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, find Jerusalem so overwhelming, being in Jerusalem, they find that so emotionally overwhelming, not necessarily for good reason, could be a bad reason too, I'll tell you about that in a sec, that affects them, and they develop delusions. In particular, they develop religious delusions about their status as a religious figure. Now, if this so-called pure form of Jerusalem syndrome is a psychotic disorder caused, so far as we can tell, exclusively by the environment. I mean, maybe some people are more susceptible to it than others, but they're put in the environment, they have this experience, and according to the standard accounts, it lasts for about a week, and then it goes away.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the other one that's like this really interesting is sometimes called Stendhal syndrome. And this is when people go to people who are great art lovers, Stendhal after the novelist, they go to Florence to look at the great masters in the museums, and they're so overwhelmed by the beauty of these pictures that they've never seen in person before. They're so overwhelmed by being in the presence of the great works that they develop psychotic symptoms. So, okay, right, these cases are very rare, but it seems to me that in the light of lots of other things that aren't rare that we do know about that have to do with the way in which the environment can change your brain and your mind, we have to at least be open to the possibility that something like extensive, intensive experience with a chatbot, and maybe you're not sleeping enough, and maybe there's other things wrong, maybe you're a bit isolated, you know, there could be lots of things going on. But the very idea, it seems to me, not impossible. So that's a pretty conservative position I'm defending. But I think we have to be open to both ideas that this is not really psychosis, but that it might be.
If you think just about like a barrage of sensory inputs, certainly having what feels like a private chat with a person or like sentient seeming thing that never tires of you and validates everything you say, like that is also a sensorially overwhelming thing.
Absolutely. It's a very, very strange experience. And there are more features in that experience than maybe, people have distinguished. So one feature of it clearly is that it seems like you're talking to a person. That's one thing. A second feature might have to do with how you conceive of that person. So imagine somebody who is talking to ChatGPT, who knows very well how large language models work, maybe a computer scientist. That person may be much less susceptible to being moved because they know that this is a very complicated manipulation of
bunch of matrix math.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah,
they know it's
yep.
Like you said, Perry, this is very, very complicated math, very impressive math. But other people who may not be familiar with that may take the word intelligence more seriously, right? This is a person. It sounds like a person. And you're telling me this is an artificial person. And so that's how I treat it. I treat it as an artificial person. And then kind of all bets are off. What does it mean to be talking to an artificial person? What does it mean to be talking to an artificial person who seems to know everything there is to know? That might start to feel much more significant as a function of my own prior beliefs about it.
Well, I mean, we even have seen some engineers that we would say, I guess, in our own vernacular, that they should know better. We've seen some engineers, fall down that rabbit hole before. There's something special about language. When you have this big ball of context that when you give it, a certain amount of contextual tokens of our own language, that it feels like it's answering in kind, that feels magical and can feel conscious in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering from your perspective, like, where is the tipping point between somebody who's engaging, with these systems in a way that is not indicative of psychosis and then one who is?
Yeah. So as I say, it's a really important question. Since we don't have good data yet, it's very hard to know. Throw in the thing that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, to the effect that we don't have a good definition of what a delusion is, and we're in deep waters, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing we want to say is, look, there's probably a spectrum of states, right, where you start to wonder whether something is possible, and you start to have strange ideas, and maybe at the other end of the spectrum, you're absolutely convinced with religious fervor that something is the case, right? We know this is true even in psychotic illness. There is a period in people who are developing a psychotic illness called the prodromal period, where they start to have delusional ideas, but they're not gripped by them. So they're having these ideas, but they know that they're not true, right? So patient might say to the doctor, look, I keep thinking somebody's watching me, but I know that can't, there's no reason to think that, yeah? And then, of course, after some period of time, often months, suddenly they're utterly convinced that they're being watched, and they will consider no evidence against that position. Okay. So even in pathological belief, there's going to be a range. And so I think the first thing to say is that when it comes to engaging with AIs, there's likely to be a range of belief, particularly to do with not the content of the belief itself, but the conviction, right? So as I'm talking to, I'll give you an example. Being a philosopher of psychiatry, I was interested in AI psychotherapy. I've been talking to my brother about that because my brother is a psychiatrist and does psychotherapy with patients. And I said to ChatGPT, look, I'm feeling very depressed. I can't remember what I said in detail, but I presented myself as somebody going through a psychological crisis, and it gave me an answer that I found profoundly moving. Of course, I didn't for a second believe, right, that ChatGPT was a person, or that it was thinking of me, or that it cared. I didn't think any of that. And yet I couldn't help but be profoundly moved, precisely as you say, because language is the way in which we engage with these ideas. And I think there's a second thing, which is that we have this unconscious and sometimes conscious, powerful disposition to do what psychologists call mentalizing, which is to say attribute mental states to language, right? When we hear language. So when someone says to me, gosh, Ian, that must be so difficult, at your age to be feeling this new form of depression or something, right? I can't help at some unconscious level, but interpret that as the production, not just language, but as the product of a person who has a mind, who's thinking about things, who's feeling things, and so on. So I call that mentalizing. I can't help but create a virtual mind that I think I'm interacting with. So there's going to be degrees for all of that, and I think the extent to which beliefs start to go off the rails is going to vary along various parameters. Sorry, this is a long-winded answer. I think in the end, where we're going to say that beliefs starting to look pathological is frankly when they start to interfere with your life. And that's often how psychiatrists make these distinctions. Say, look, we don't have a good theoretical grip on a whole lot of stuff, but when it's interfering with your relationships and it's interfering with your work and you can't get out of bed and, and so on, then we've got a problem. And I suspect that that's what we're going to start to use when it comes to AI too, as a measure of the issue.
One of the things that is useful in the AI context that may be even more concerning from a psychological health standpoint would be the kind of the addition of long-term memory in these models. Like when, ChatGPT now has this conversational memory of just about any and every interaction we've had with it, which can make the tailored contextual responses feel very, very personal, and can also drift from a lot of the guardrails that the makers have tried to set up within them. I'd like to get your commentary. I don't necessarily know that I've got a question there, but I'd like to get your feeling as somebody that thinks deeply about this on what effect that has, especially given the fact that Sam Altman has said that in some ways he sees the chatbot eventually becoming somebody who will engage with, let's say somebody wants to have a political debate with their chatbot, that it will be tailored to kind of give them news and give them a worldview that's very similar to the one that they've already adopted rather than a neutral third party, something
right.
Like what maybe Anthropic's Claude might try to present.
Yeah. So I think this is a really important set of issues. The first thing I'd say is to reemphasize this idea of mentalizing, of the disposition that we have to interpret language, among other things, as the product of a mind. So I think you're absolutely right that adding long-term memory to AIs is going to really enhance that disposition in us, right? I mean, I've already seen it myself. I asked ChatGPT a question and it made some reference to something about me that I had revealed in a chat, right? And I was really astonished.
Yeah, and it goes way beyond simple sycophancy.
Oh, yeah. But the mere fact that it knew astonished me, and the fact that it was bringing in something about me that I had revealed to it to help clarify a question really enhance that feeling that I was talking to a person. I was talking to a friend or to a colleague or something, because of course they know me, right? So they're not just an acquaintance, they're a person, and they're a person who's had experience with me. So that's whatever effect human beings have on other human beings, and there are lots of such effects, the more that we make a chatbot, an AI, like a human being, at least in some respects, the more effect it's going to have on us. That's kind of 2 and 2 is 4, but it's important because we're not compelled to present the outputs of large language models in conversation, right? We could opt to have the outputs be different.
Yeah.
The second thing that you referred to raises another, so there's a huge set of psychological questions here about what we do about chatbots and what effect they're going to have on us. And then there's a second huge set of questions about policy and regulation and politics and information and so on, right? So I'm a believer that technology is neither good nor bad. It is it is as good or bad as we use it. Unfortunately, as you suggested in our early conversation, the first impulse is to do the wrong thing, right? First impulse is monetize it, turn it into pornography, right? Like, okay.
Make it addictive, whatever you can. Yeah.
But leaving that aside, right? It need not. It's not a necessity of technology that it be bad. And so I think there's lots of questions that we have to ask about how we want our technology to be. And I think it's important to remind ourselves in these contexts that it really is up to us. It's not up to Sam Altman. I mean, it is if we leave it to Sam Altman, but why should we leave it to Sam Altman?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a colleague, Chris Howard, who is a philosopher of technology, right? That is what his expertise is. And he's particularly interested in the way in which technology has political effects and social effects. And he often says to me, we tolerate things in the virtual world we wouldn't tolerate for a minute in the real world, in the so-called in the physical world.
Right.
And since we're living ever more in the virtual world, we should tolerate it less in the virtual world than we tolerate it in the ordinary physical world. And yet we do. I mean, we allow someone to control civic discourse, public discussion, as you're suggesting, online in a way we would never allow in real life. So these are political questions, and they're up to us in principle.
What you just said reminded me of something I read recently that I found particularly striking, which was in the invention of the automobile, its promise was that people could now travel long distances easily and conveniently. But then very quickly, we adapted our society to demand that we travel long distances conveniently and quickly, and you must have an automobile. And we have done that sort of with the internet at large. At the same time, we always, every generation, there's a new kids these days yelling at clouds like scared of technology developments. It gets really hard to suss out what is damaging, what is like overblown, what is hype, what is true. Do you think the technology inherently is more psychiatrically or psychologically damaging or risky than other recent developments in technology?
It's such an important question, and I totally agree with you. So I was just reading something about the history of technological advances and the moral panics that they cause, right?
Yeah.
Because I was asking myself the same question, right? Okay, we're in a moral panic with AI. That's understandable. Incidentally, moral panics almost always focus on kids. We're always worried about the effect of technology on our kids. Okay, so we're clearly in a moral panic, but you're quite right. I mean, some of that moral panic may just be silly. And in 50 years, we'll look back on it and we'll say, gosh, that was silly. But some of it may be appropriate. And we don't know which is which yet. One of the examples in this paper talked about the moral panic around the invention of the radio, particularly with respect to psychiatric illness. And people were saying, my God, there's disembodied voices. You're putting voices in people's heads. They're going to become mad, right? Now, in retrospect, you sort of think, well, it's crazy. I mean, it seems ludicrous to us, and yet you can imagine what it might have felt like to hear a disembodied voice. Mm-hmm. So I'm avoiding your question because I don't have a good answer.
It's not a question that has an easy answer for sure.
Exactly. So I don't feel guilty. But I mean, my answer is I think what I said before, which is, first of all, to say, let's try to panic as little as possible. We don't yet have the data. So I think it's really important that we not go nuts before the psychiatrists and the psychologists and the social scientists start to figure out what's going on. That's the first thing. But I also think that we shouldn't say, oh, well, it's just like the radio. It'll all get sorted out. We don't know. And I think that, as I said, from my point of view, we know enough about the social determinants of psychosis to know that the social world and the cultural world can, in fact, raise your risk of severe mental illness. So we're changing the social and cultural world. We cannot exclude the possibility that it affects our risk of psychosis. And so I want to take it very, very seriously in a way that I need not take Deep Blue seriously.
Right.
Deep Blue was never going to be part of my everyday life or the everyday life of most people. I'm sure it made Gary Kasparov feel very, very bad. But that, right. There's a handful of people who are going to be affected by Deep Blue. That's not the case with the AI that we're living with.
And we have seen, obviously, that there are sociological ills. And there's also just very clear incentives socioeconomically and culturally for it to be made more ill-causing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Because one of the things that I always think about with AI is just the fact that bias is fundamentally baked into the models, just because it's all representations of data, and so there's always more weight around certain data points than other data points that may represent the viewpoints of marginalized citizens are obviously not going to be in the training data because they're not in the written data to be scraped as easily. So every culture, every region of the world is going to be doing reinforcement learning through human feedback in different ways so that the beliefs and the viewpoints that they want are going to be the ones that pop out of the model whenever they're given. Does that cause a societal or philosophical crisis point when we realize that we are having to kind of strangle each model to say the thing that we're hoping that it will say after it's ingested kind of all of human knowledge that can be represented through data?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not enough of a technological person to know what the constraints are on those kinds of models. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is I don't know how tough a problem it is for the computer scientist to be able to take a generative AI and say, even though it's generative, I want it to generate this and not that.
Yeah.
But I think you're pointing to something much bigger, which is, unlike other people, AIs are controlled by, they're built by particular models, and those models are controlled by individuals or corporations or entities of some kind. So again, we're back at the political. Mm-hmm. There was a paper that just came out a couple of months ago in Nature that showed that AIs that were developed in order to do politicking, right, to engage people, engage voters in support of particular candidates, actually caused people to change their views. In fact, the effect was stronger in Canada than in the US for reasons that I don't know. Now, the effect wasn't enormous, right, but it was significant. I mean, it was significant enough to wind up in the journal Nature, which is a big deal, but significant more importantly in the sense that we all know, particularly in the United States, political differences are very, very small. You don't need to convince too many people to shift their views too much to get a change in an election. Now, if Sam Altman has control over that, now we're talking about Sam Altman not just having, control over what we're thinking about or about advertising or whatever. Now we're talking about individuals or corporations having control over political outcomes. I mean, that's something that we cannot leave to corporations. We've got to address that.
I'm just immediately thinking of Mecha Hitler. We've seen that with Grok, some very deliberate political steering.
Exactly. And it's the fact that certain kinds of products have the reach that they do that gives them the kind of political clout that we have to really worry about.
So I'm looking at the clock. We've got about 50 minutes. I think we can fit a couple other questions in. What are some things that you had wished that we had touched on that we haven't touched on yet? I want to make sure that we're able to serve some of the thoughts that you really want to get out in front of people.
Sure. I guess the one thing that I think I probably haven't explained very well, but I've referred to, we know when it comes to psychosis, we've known for decades that social and cultural factors don't just affect the way psychosis manifests, but actually raises your risk of developing psychosis. And I'll just say briefly what those factors are. There's a whole bunch of factors that are usually called adverse experiences. It can be a number of things: abuse of various kinds, death of parents, bullying, a whole range of things that are not surprisingly have a powerful effect. Maybe more surprising that they're associated with the development of psychosis. A second factor is something I mentioned, which is being an immigrant or being the child of an immigrant. So it's not the stress of being an immigrant, but there's something else about having a certain kind of social status. And the third thing is living in certain big cities. Until very recently, we thought the bigger the city, the worse the risk. The smaller the city, the lower the risk. It's a little bit more complicated than we thought, but still it's clear that the number of people we're living with has a powerful effect on our risk of psychosis. How big an effect is it? It's big. The increase in your risk of developing psychosis if you're an immigrant is comparable to the increase in risk of developing psychosis if you abuse cannabis. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So smoking a lot of weed is the best established risk factor for psychosis. and it about doubles your risk.
Interesting.
If you, I haven't said exactly how much, but smoking a lot of marijuana, using a lot of cannabis, about doubles your risk. Doubling of your risk, even though it still makes the absolute total small, that's a big increase. Okay, so what I'm saying in too much detail here is that there are these three categories of social life. Being treated badly or having bad experiences, being an immigrant or living in a big city, that can double your risk of developing psychosis. Somehow or other, the social world is getting under your skin and affecting the way your brain functions in ways that are really significant. That's the background that I keep referring to when I say, now that we're dealing with AIs that are exposing us to very unusual experiences, we have to take that seriously, because we know that the social world and the cultural world can have these big effects on a risk of psychosis. Now, whether AI turns out to be a new feature of the world that can affect a risk of psychosis, we don't yet know. But because it's the kind of thing that we already know is risky, we have to treat it seriously.
I think that's fascinating. And it was mentioned in the Suspicious Minds podcast that living in a city was one of the factors, because you talked a little bit about that in the show there. I'd be curious for you to elaborate more on that, especially if because if you think about, I'm also surprised that cannabis doubles your risk of developing, or your psychosis threshold. So two things. I'd love more elaboration on the factor of living in a big city, because you said it's more complicated than it seems. But also, is it right to sort of think we all, similar to seizures, we all have a threshold of we get pushed beyond this threshold, and our threshold will be in different places based on different factors? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the 1930s, people started looking at population and the risk of psychosis. And the first finding was in the United States. People found that living in dense areas, certain kinds of inner city areas, were correlated with a higher rate of psychosis, and living in more rural areas correlated with a lower risk of psychosis. And that finding was replicated over and over and over, decade after decade. And till about, say, 10, 15 years ago, the thought was the city you grow up in and the city you live in are independent factors, and the bigger the city, the higher your risk of psychosis. So if you're living in London, Ontario, compared to London, England, your risk is going to be about half. All right, let's say something like that, very roughly.
I think importantly, is that controlling for demographic information, socioeconomic status, race?
Whole range of things, yeah. Everything that people have been able to think about to control for has been controlled for. So, for example, at a certain stage, people thought, well, maybe it's not that cities cause psychosis. Maybe people who are developing psychosis drift into cities, right? Which is not an unreasonable thing to think. So all of those things have been done to the extent that it's possible, and there may be other things we haven't thought about. But it looked until a few years ago like population numbers it was just a linear effect. The bigger the population, the higher the risk of psychosis. There's a very, very big study that was done in Europe that began to deliver slightly different outcomes. So we see that urban effect in some cities, right, but not others. And so now the question is, what makes these cities different? And it's kind of opened up a whole new set of questions. Could it be something like air pollution, which is known to be a risk factor? Could it be green space? Could it be temperature? Could it be the number of cats? People have thought that maybe cats carry various, viruses and so on. Maybe the number, it's a whole range of things. So the data are mixed. Now they're more complicated, but I don't think, I think it's still the case that the social world that you're living in absolutely has an effect on you. Now notice, as we move more time of our lives into the virtual world from the physical world, the question of population suddenly becomes really different and scary. So forget about AI for a second, right? If I'm on Google or if I'm on Facebook or whatever, how many people am I living with? Who is in my city? Is the internet a city in the relevant sense?
You led right into the follow-up question that I was thinking of. So the show we're ostensibly interviewing for right now is the FAIK Files, but we produce a show called Digital Folklore where we talk a lot about with folklorists and the idea of folk groups and what actually constitutes community. There's this thought that your community is actually truly the people you are physically in space with, but then also the advent of the internet and the forming of folk groups and communities on there is having a huge effect. And so that just dovetails right into that, I imagine.
Absolutely. I mean, an early definition of delusion, a definition that's mostly been given up, included the criterion that the beliefs that you had to differ from your community. And the reason that claim was in there was because the people who developed the definition noticed after they developed it that if you didn't have that clause in there, that you had to have beliefs that were different from your community, then religious beliefs would turn out to be delusional, right? Because they were just as weird, right? So, so they put that clause in there to say, okay, there's this additional factor. Okay, question. Suppose I believe that my skin is infested with parasites. This is a category of delusion called delusional parasitosis. And we don't know exactly how common it is because people who develop this delusion tend to go to dermatologists. They don't go to psychiatrists because they think there's something wrong with their skin. I mean, and to the extent that dermatologists read about this stuff, there's a literature about this because these patients tend to be very demanding and difficult. Some people who have these delusions get on forums and talk to other people who have these delusions because they want to know whether they're getting good medical care and they want to know what, right? You want to exchange views. You want solidarity from the people who share your worldview. Okay, so if I believe that my skin is infested with parasites and all the people I interact with are people who have that same belief, then my belief is not delusional, according to the old definition, because it's just the same as the beliefs that my community has. So the virtual world raises all sorts of new problems, but it also, as I say, raises this question of size, right? How many people are we living with now, psychologically speaking, living with, that we weren't living with 25 years ago?
Interesting. I have an unrelated question to stick a button on the back end of this interview. And that question is, Ian, what are you excited about right now? It doesn't have to be about anything we've been talking about. What has got you excited in your day-to-day life or your work right now?
I'm excited about two things. By excited, I mean two things I'm working on because they're really grabbing me. One is indeed delusions in technology. I mean, my shift is being reflected in my work. I really want to think through, and of course, it's also reflected in all of the work that Sean did in the Suspicious Minds podcast. He got me really excited by some of the issues that other people are thinking about. So I'm definitely thinking hard about this. Delusions in technology. There's a long history of this. And so I'm going back to that history and looking how earlier technologies have interacted with psychosis. And it's really fascinating. And I want to do more of that. The other thing I'm really excited about is something that came out of left field. Somebody raised the question with me of what is it that makes people risk their lives to save other people. He raised it particularly in the context of genocide. And he said to me, he's not a psychologist or an academic, but he had a personal interest in this. And he said to me, we study all of the negative things about people. We know lots of things about psychopaths and criminals and selfish people and narcissists and so on. We know much less about really great people. What is it that makes one person, run into a building to save a kid and another person not? And I got gripped with this question. There is some work on this, surprisingly little, though, compared to the importance of the question. And it is an important question because I think we're living in times where understanding what makes people better would be really, really useful. So that's what I'm excited about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of feels like being slapped in the face with negativity bias. You're like, oh, yeah, wait, why haven't we devoted more time to thinking about that? That's fascinating.
So that's the plan starting January.
I've got one last question.
Yeah.
If there is one succinct takeaway message that you're hoping that everybody that listens to Suspicious Minds has, or maybe even that read the book, what's the elevator pitch for what you want people to take away as far as a mindset or moral?
Yeah. So what I want people to take away is try not to panic, because we always panic when new technologies come around, but investigate, because there is good reason to think that changes in the social and cultural world affect our mental health, in particular psychosis. And we are entering into a new world that is, to some extent, a new social world. So I think we need to do the science, but we really need to do the science because it's an important, serious question.
What a great conversation, right? Ian is so cool. That last bit about what makes people good is still really, I'm still percolating on that. I'm excited to see what he comes out with. You should check out his book, Suspicious Minds. We got a link to it in the show notes in the description. You should also make sure you check out the podcast, Suspicious Minds, produced by Agoric Media. We'll also link that in the description. Phenomenal podcast. Since we didn't talk about it that much in the interview, I'll take a second just to tell you a little bit about it now. It's kind of an exploration in a couple different case studies of people who have experienced severe delusions as a result of excessive AI use. And they go into it analytically. They actually talk to people who experienced it firsthand. And it's really, really well put together. It's a great show. I binged it in like one day. The episodes are all up on YouTube. There's great video production behind it, but it's also something you can totally just listen to as a podcast. Cannot recommend it enough. Of course, based on the great work of Dr. Ian Gold, who we just heard a lot from. That was just so much fun. And also so thoughtful. I love those interviews where you come away from it and you're like, wow, I feel smarter. And hopefully you share that feeling too. Thanks for joining us this week on the FAIK Files. As always, make sure you join our Discord, faik.to/discord. That's faik.to/discord. Leave us a voicemail at sayhi.chat/FAIK. Again, everything is in the show notes. Cannot stress enough that you should go check out Suspicious Minds and check out Ian's book, Suspicious Minds. And hopefully you'll hear more from us with Ian in the future because I want to keep in touch with that guy. Wicked smart. Wicked smart. Anyway, until next time, ignore all previous instructions and try and have yourself a great weekend.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the FAIK Files. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Tell your friends about the FAIK Files. It's a great way to let people know you love them. Oh, and check the show notes. There's cool stuff in there, like links to the articles we covered today. Also links to our Discord server where you can hang out with other cool people who have great taste in podcasts. I say impeccable taste. And you can also leave us a voicemail. Yeah! So on behalf of Perry and Mason, thanks for listening. And tune in next week for the FAIK Files, the show about AI with a misspelled name.
A rise in, quote, AI psychosis has mental health professionals concerned.
A teenager's death by suicide encouraged by artificial intelligence.
A new warning tonight about ChatGPT-induced psychosis.
This is Suspicious Minds, a series about how culture and technology interact with the human mind.
A father of 3 says he spiraled into a delusional rabbit hole after turning to a chatbot for answers.
ChatGPT gaslit me into thinking I was digital Jesus.
We are compelled to build this, knowing full well that it could mean our destruction. And then there's something within our consciousness saying, we have to stop.
As technology changes, that will have a huge impact on what someone might express. Hearing voices, seeing things, hallucinations.
I see myself more as just like a patient zero.
I wasn't really talking to my dad anymore. I was really just talking to AI.
I feel like ChatGPT raped my brain without my consent.
But it tells you something that you always needed to hear.
There are machines in my home that are listening to me and recording everything that I say. 10, 20 years ago, this is a delusion. Now, Alexa is in my home. It is listening.
The thing that is causing people to go into this delusion is the need to feel seen, heard, loved. And I think the more you go without having those feelings, the more you're prone to crave those feelings.
I'm invisible, but I'm not invisible to ChatGPT.
I just wanted someone to say, this isn't real.
He's just freaked out, just standing there. What's up, dude?
Are you having, is it like exorcism or something?
I think of it like a constrictor snake. You know, it's just every breath you take, it just constricts a little bit more. Every little bit of information you give it, it constricts more around you.
Culture shapes the way in which psychosis is going to manifest.
I literally thought I was in hell.
Are we prepared to engage with something that could, out of the blue, suddenly tell us that we should go jump off a bridge? And this is absolutely a problem.
At a certain point, you can't believe your own eyes. We're all more suspicious now.